Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. My name is Sarah Humphreville, and I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to Oxford University Press's roundtable discussion, New Perspectives, New Possibilities, the Power of Interdisciplinary Research. I'm looking forward to introducing our panelists shortly, but before I do, a few notes to keep in mind for those of us who are joining us live. So 2 things to note. The first is that this will be recorded. By attending this roundtable, you're consenting to being recorded. We will be routing this recording after its completion to everyone who signed up. In addition, on the right side of y'all's screens, you should be able to see a chat, a Q&A, and a polls tab. We'll be running a couple of polls throughout the discussion, so we encourage you to participate in those when you are prompted to do so, and then also to go ahead and start putting questions or notes into the chat and Q&A, so that once we get through the presentation and the roundtable discussion, we can answer some of the questions that you guys have at the end. So as mentioned, my name is Sarah Humphreville, and I'm an executive editor here at Oxford University Press. I'm thrilled to be joined today by 4 academic experts on interdisciplinarity and research. I will invite them each in turn to introduce themselves and talk for a minute or two about their interest and experience in interdisciplinarity thought and practice. So first, Cameron Buckner, would you like to come off of mute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation. So my name is Cameron Buckner, and I'm currently a professor and Donald F. Cronin Endowed Chair in the Humanities at University of Florida. I actually started in computer science and artificial intelligence, and I asked so many pesky questions that they told me there was a place for those questions over there in the philosophy department. In particular, how the pretty abstract models of rationality and decision making we were working on in AI related to the way that humans and animals actually make decisions. And so I went and got a PhD in philosophy at Indiana University, specializing in cognitive science. And I did some empirical work with animals, in particular ravens. And in the meantime, AI, as you might have heard, has been on the upswing in the last 5 or 10 years. And so I kind of came back to AI with some of the insights that I feel like I learned from working on questions in animal research. As a philosopher of science, what I really try to do is I look for places in science where questions arise that can't be answered just by sciencing harder. What is intelligence? How do we know what's going on in the thought processes of non-linguistic animals, things like that. And I found that to be a very productive approach. I'm happy to say more later in response to the other questions, but that's the basic idea.
Perfect. Welcome, Cameron. Next, we have Margaret Hu. Margaret?
Hi, my name is Margaret Hu. I'm a professor of law at William and Mary Law School. I'm also director of the Digital Democracy Lab at the law school. And my interest in this area came from 10 years of practice in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. My first day in the U.S. Department of Justice was the day before the terrorist attacks, September 10th, 2001. And in the decade that I spent in the Justice Department, I saw the explosive growth of data collection, aggregation, storage, and analysis for counterterrorism and border security purposes. And when I left, I decided to turn cyber surveillance and AI analytics into my research agenda. I now do research at the intersection of civil rights, technology, law, policy, and cyber surveillance, as well as AI governance. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much, Margaret. Next, Christine Gerard.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. So my name is Christine Gerard. I'm a professor of 18th century literature and culture. The 18th century, of course, is the last great age of pre-disciplinarity. And I am currently the director of Torch, which is the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, which is a centre for interdisciplinary research, which has existed for more than a decade, connecting humanities scholars with external partners and people from across disciplines and divisions. And we operate a number of seed funding calls. Our research hubs and networks focus on global challenges. And we have many interdisciplinary projects on the go. And why I'm excited about it, particularly at the moment as a subject, is that Oxford is shortly to open the Schwarzman Center for the Humanities, a huge 180 million investment in the humanities, which brings our separate faculties together across the humanities, but also will have interdisciplinary centres such as the Oxford Internet Institute and the Centre for Ethics and AI. And we are also thinking a lot about how to respond to challenge-led funding calls around interdisciplinary teams. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. And last but certainly not least, Robert Frodman, would you like to come off mute and introduce yourself?
Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Robert Frodman. I'm a recently retired professor of philosophy. My background is a PhD in philosophy. And then after that, I quit a tenure-track position and went back to school to get a master's in paleoclimatology. This then led to an 8-year stint with the U.S. Geological Survey, not as a geologist, but in terms of helping them make their science more policy relevant. That in turn led to a position at a policy institute at the University of Colorado in 2002. Then finally, I was offered a position at the University of North Texas to start a new PhD program in philosophy with an interdisciplinary emphasis. My academic work in and on interdisciplinarity includes being the editor of the 2 volumes of the Oxford Handbook of Interdisciplinarity, and then a book on the theory of interdisciplinarity called Sustainable Knowledge. And I also founded the first center for the study of interdisciplinarity at North Texas in 2008. Finally, over the last 6 or 8 years, my work has enlarged, and at least that's how I view it, toward what you could call a critique of interdisciplinarity, or better said, placing interdisciplinarity within a historical context of the future, the past and future of the modern research university.
Perfect. On behalf of the press, again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to actually getting to discuss some of these issues with you all. So the next 50 or so minutes will be spent as follows. First, I will present some of OUP's recent internal market research on interdisciplinarity and provide some context for the forthcoming panel discussion. Following that brief presentation, I have a number of questions for our panelists to discuss. During that time, all of you guys in attendance, we strongly encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A. I have colleagues behind the scenes who will be sorting and routing the questions. So hopefully, with whatever time remains, we can get through as many as possible. So to kick us off, and so that we have a shared understanding going into the discussion, I'd like to propose the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of interdisciplinary. So as we refer to interdisciplinary throughout, we are defining it as of or pertaining to 2 or more disciplines or branches of learning, contributing to or benefiting from 2 or more disciplines. So why are we doing this panel? As a university press, Oxford is constantly thinking about how we can ensure our authors' research reaches the widest audience. In a growing digital research environment, we believe that we are witnessing in real time how research methods are adapting to grappling with multiple complex topics at any time, topics and issues that transcend a single discipline or point of view. Our belief is that fostering interdisciplinary perspectives gives students, researchers, and the wider interested public better tools to tackle sophisticated problems. But we know it isn't as simple as all of that. That idea, however, is what we want to discuss here in a few moments. But first, I'm going to present some of that market research. So if you bear with me as I toggle the slides over. So in order to dig deeper on trends in interdisciplinary research, we engaged our market research panel, which is a global network of scholars who agreed to engage with us periodically on market trends, on this idea in September of this year. We received a total of 76 responses to our flash survey and queried the group on 3 questions, the first of which is visible here. To what extent is your work interdisciplinary? As you can see, while nearly a third of the respondents reflect their work as solely or predominantly single discipline, 2/3 volunteered their work as interdisciplinary. So let's test this out with the group of attendees we have here today. So in a few moments, you will see a poll popping up on your screen posing the same question. Let's take a few moments to answer. So if you toggle over to the right side of your screen, answers and responses from folks should hopefully start to populate through while we wait for those to appear. Still open. Yes, so you can see here, perhaps it's a slightly self-selecting group, but we are seeing a large proportion of folks come in at predominantly interdisciplinary. Right now it's about 33, with a handful of folks being predominantly single discipline. So I think it very much parallels the research that we had put together. So our next question that we have posed for the market research panel was, why now? As the wide-ranging and absolutely incredible bios of our panelists would indicate, the interest and availability of interdisciplinary research is not necessarily new. One of the other questions we wanted to ask in our research was whether we think that interdisciplinarity has grown in recent years. And so we asked, do we think that interdisciplinarity is more or less important than it was 10 years ago? So as a preview before getting to see the rest of the market research, we have our second poll here. Do you think interdisciplinarity is more or less important than it was 10 years ago? So if everyone could take a moment to go ahead and submit, and we wait for those responses to come through. So yes, so as you can see, the answer was a resounding yes with our market research panel, and is quickly becoming a resounding yes for you guys in attendance as well. So taking those two ideas together, let me just pull this back up again. Sorry, went backwards accidentally. Okay, so the last question here that we asked of our market research panel really captures the heart of this discussion. Why do a majority of us feel this way? So through our market research, a few key themes emerged. One of which was importance of opportunities for funding and collaboration. 11 of our respondents called this out specifically to say that interdisciplinary work is seen as opening up new opportunities for needed research funding. Some respondents noted how funding bodies require interdisciplinary approaches now, though a few folks wanted to make sure to note that institutional support on the ground for interdisciplinary research and practice is still lagging behind. Another key theme that emerged was the increased overall awareness, and 10 respondents cited that most particularly. Many believe that there's a growing awareness of the interconnections between different academic disciplines, possibly fostered by the growth of digital research practices, which accounts for the increase in popularity of interdisciplinary work. One respondent noted in particular, it was always important, but people would simply not acknowledge it. So the largest number of respondents, however, cited the need for interdisciplinary thought and practice as essential for addressing complex global challenges such as climate change, the growth of AI, pandemics, and social inequalities, all topics that transcend a single discipline. Respondents cited how collaboration between researchers from different fields can lead to better and more interesting results and better questions for future research and exploration. So it's here that we will pivot to breaking down some of these ideas further with the panel. So we will bring them back on screen shortly and turn it over to them. Wonderful. Hi, guys. So my first question here, so we just heard about how interdisciplinarity has been viewed as more important than ever and that its value is reflected in funder priorities. Asking you each in turn, perhaps starting with Christine, would you agree that interdisciplinarity is more important now in your eyes? I'm so sorry. I think we got to get your mic on for a second.
Whoops, there we are. Sorry, there was a buzz. Yes, I definitely think that's true. I think that in a more globally aware world, I think in which we are conscious of major challenges such as environmental disaster, democratic resilience, forced migration, aging populations, and so forth, that we have a kind of civic role to play in addressing those problems. And we think and believe that interdisciplinarity will help solve those issues. Whether that's really the case or not is a question for discussion, but it's certainly a faith, I think, that many of us have, that siloed thinking doesn't work, and therefore we need to collaborate with each other to address these issues. Yeah.
Perfect. Cameron, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think interdisciplinarity has always been really important, especially because it at the frontier of disciplines and pushing the methods in new directions and challenging fundamental assumptions, I think, is essential to progress. But I recently wrote a book that takes interdisciplinary perspectives from psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, ethology on artificial intelligence. So I think, the obvious reason why it's so important today is because artificial intelligence is becoming just ubiquitous everywhere and reshaping everything in ways that are very difficult to predict or control in every other discipline. And it's to do this well, to do this responsibly, and to produce systems that are trustworthy. Data engineers and designers of these systems need to understand where the data comes from for whatever domain they're working on. And they need to understand how the systems are in turn going to interact with the communities that are using them, whether it's medicine, law, business, the way social media is creating echo chambers, reshaping political discourse. I'm sure everyone is thinking of their own versions of these challenges in their own disciplines. And so I think that the computer scientists and the data engineers absolutely need to be able to understand how they're going to access this vast treasure trove of disciplinary knowledge from other disciplines about where the data come from, how the data might be biased, how the data and the algorithms they're using might have assumptions built in that they might not be aware of or subjecting to sufficient critical scrutiny. And then in turn, everyone in the various disciplines needs to understand how the AI systems work at least some basic level and be ready to use them to enhance their own research, get better results, but also be providing the important critical feedback that the AI system designers need to make systems that are going to make human society and knowledge collection better rather than worse. So I always say in all of my talks and in my book, this is an all hands on deck problem because things are just moving so incredibly quickly. So everybody needs to be paying attention to this right now.
No, I think that that all hands on deck aspect of that, I want us to come back to that a little bit later when we think specifically about interdisciplinarity and AI. But Margaret, I'm going to turn to you. Same question.
Yeah, I can agree more with what the other speakers have shared about how in this now, I think, age of AI, that we're facing unprecedented challenges in all of the areas that are pressing concerns, whether it is climate change or medical research or inequities or other types of geopolitical conflicts. I think that it's all being touched by AI. And I think that AI, data, other emerging technologies, they don't really recognize borders, sovereignty, or power the way that we once negotiated those areas. And so I think that the interdisciplinary that requires understanding that we're faced with a new knowledge structure, but also the ways in which we conduct research in order to make sense of that new knowledge structure is so critically important that we need to draw upon all of the thinking and all of the frameworks and theories of other fields in order to best manage a prescription and policies that can take us forward into the future while preserving our commitments to, for example, a constitutional democracy or the rule of law.
No, perfect. Sorry, I'm taking about 1,000 notes, which I should not be doing while moderating this panel. Thank you, Margaret. All right, Robert, to you.
Thank you. I guess I'd want to make 2 points here. First, interdisciplinarity is not going to go away. But second, I increasingly see conversations about interdisciplinarity as being as forming a transitional state to a set of larger questions. And I think the rise of AI, especially ChatGPT, in the last year and a half or so, 2 years now, highlights this point. Interdisciplinarity is an innovation within the disciplinary university, but I do think we still need to question the priors of disciplinarity itself. One of these priors is the assumption, the tacit assumption, because I very rarely see it debated, that knowledge production should be infinite. And AI highlights the dangers of infinite knowledge production. And so what I imagine in a kind of, if I may call it a post-interdisciplinary era, one of the questions on the table will be the limitation, the possible limitation or governance of knowledge production. Artificial intelligence and the dangers it represents is, of course, a highly salient example of this. But you could also point to a variety of other technologies, such as gain of function research, which may or may not have led to the COVID epidemic of 2020 and 2021. And so this is the kind of framing I would like to put on questions of interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard anyone actually mention thinking about the limits of knowledge production and all of that. I would love for us to come back to that if we have a chance at the end of this. So thinking a little bit, given that this is Oxford University Press, how would you guys respond to the question of how do norms in academic publishing support or disincentivize interdisciplinary scholarship? And Cameron, would you like to kick off with that first?
Sure. So yeah, I've published in a lot of different disciplines at this point, and collaborated with psychologists, biologists, computer scientists. I've actually found it pretty easy to publish interdisciplinary. In particular, I think you're likely to get more citations, you're likely to have a broader audience, and I haven't seen huge roadblocks to actually getting things published. I'm now also an editor at a few different places, and I see some of the challenges on the other side of the table. In particular, it's really challenging to get qualified reviewers. So sometimes things can take longer to review. It would be good if we could come up with some practices from the editorial side that were more routine and made it less of a headache to figure out how to get interdisciplinary research properly evaluated. But I haven't seen that many roadblocks in my own experiences on the publishing side. I may be jumping the question a little bit, but I think where the challenges typically show up are in promotion and tenure, which tends to be the most conservative part of the university system. So one thing I definitely did when I was on the tenure clock is I stopped doing all the interdisciplinary research I was doing, and I made sure I had a solid sort of disciplinary bound tenurable portfolio before I started doing interdisciplinary research again. And I advise other people to do that too. So I think if we were to really try to figure out how are we going to promote interdisciplinary research within the university, we need to think about how universities can, before they even try to hire an interdisciplinary researcher, have some sort of binding plans to protect and properly evaluate their interdisciplinary research before they even start the clock. But I might be jumping ahead, so I'll stop there.
No, but I think it's interesting to think of those two questions together, because the original question being about how can publishing support, or certainly how can publishing disincentivize, but also the folks who will be publishing with places in a primary academic environment, they're most likely coming from, as you say, people who are going to be working toward tenure, people who have established tenure. There is that kind of predominant school of thought that once a person receives tenure or the equivalent, that they can start exploring a little bit more experimentally. And, I think there could possibly be some restrictions on really interesting research because of that. So would, Margaret or Christine, Robert, would you guys like to jump in on either the academic publishing questions, or if you feel more strongly, the institutional support sides of the interdisciplinary argument?
Shall I just jump in? As somebody who
Jump in, yes.
I published a lot with OUP. I couldn't agree more with what Cameron has said. I love the sort of the double think actually that goes into what you need to prepare to get tenure, the single subject model, and then the much more expansive possibility of creating interdisciplinary research with other colleagues. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I would say the norms in academic publishing, we're moving away from where I began, which is the kind of lone scholar model of writing monographs and articles, towards more collaborative multi-author publishing ventures, including trade publications, blogs, podcasts, and so forth. But it depends in your university on what you're rewarded. And it all comes down, really, in my view, to when people are hired and given tenure, it's usually because they can deliver teaching and lecturing within the required field. Sorry to be so narrow about this. It's very true at Oxford, because Oxford still is very much a single subject university. And although I love to think that I work in an interdisciplinary research centre here, our teaching is all directed more so than many universities towards single subjects, particularly in humanities. So it's almost as though you have to have a sort of two identities, really, one of which is this kind of interdisciplinary, expansive, exciting kind of world, and the other which is fine, but it's actually lagging behind the other one. We don't deliver that kind of interdisciplinarity in our teaching, although I think our students would really like to see more shifts in the way the teaching and the curriculum is actually designed and delivered. So I think it is an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and also say that I think that one of the challenges with interdisciplinarity research in law, for example, is that the field of law is already so stratified, and you need to, I think, assert that you're an expert in your specific subfield. And there are certain gatekeepers, I think, in many fields that have self-appointed themselves as the individuals who are able to say who is an expert and who is not an expert. But I think that one of the very serious challenges in AI research, for example, is that it really requires, I think, especially when we're talking about AI law and policy, multi-stakeholder engagement, that there needs to be, for the research to be effective and consequential, a conversation that reaches not only across multiple fields and disciplines academically, but also industry and in the public sector as well. And I think that makes it very, very difficult. It's very time consuming, and there's various research methodologies that then need to be mastered in the private and public sectors. And then trying to assert that you have the credibility in order to speak across all of those disciplines in order to share your knowledge as somebody who can be an interdisciplinary scholar.
Yeah. Robert, would you like to add anything on that?
Sure, I'd love to. This question, I think we need to put in the context of what you could call the infosphere, and what I'd like to call the crisis of peer review. The problem is not publishing. I think that's true both for academics, but just anybody can post anything on the web. The problem rather is understanding how to relate and connect, to connect the relationship between the production and the consumption of knowledge. That's one of the great flaws of disciplinary culture. As a colleague put it at the U.S. Geological Survey long ago to me, the model at the USGS was throwing the knowledge over the fence. And I eventually asked what fence, and the fence was the one that separated science or knowledge from society. And the idea was that this is a way of guaranteeing the integrity of the knowledge production process, that you're not an advocate for you're just producing knowledge, and then it goes out in the world and people pick it up like found objects. The problem is that there's something deeply irresponsible about just throwing increasingly powerful knowledge, and especially science and technology, and into the world. And so I think the real challenge here is a transdisciplinary moment of connecting the production and consumption of knowledge. Finally, but what I mean about a crisis of peer review is that peer review operates within the academy. It has lots of problems, but it functions decently. But on the larger infosphere, as we've seen in this increasing culture of mis and disinformation, there is no peer review. Knowledge is thrown out pell-mell. If it gets enough clicks, it can become a kind of alternate reality for folks. We have been seeing the political dangers of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think a lot of what you just said ties into what Cameron was saying earlier in one of the earlier questions about, the ways that, it's so important for interdisciplinary knowledge frameworks to be applied as we all have to jump in on artificial intelligence. We all have to get up to speed to be able to kind of fit those two things together. We could do an entire other roundtable on peer review, but I'm sure that would actually be hours long. But I think that is really important for us to call out here as far as, people who are established as interdisciplinary scholars known to have that, the ability to be on panels like this and the ability to speak on certain consortia and things like that, often are the folks that certainly within the press we approach for those types of reviews. And then there becomes a question of overburdening and how we can kind of join up a little bit better on making sure that we're kind of passing some of that labor around. So, I think we've kind of talked a little bit then about, what happens for, scholars whose research falls between disciplines, concerns about that. I mean, I think from what everyone said there, the kind of, I can't remember who said the double think and the double career of what you need to do to get tenure versus what you can do after. So if we can, let's pivot a little bit to talk about AI in particular. And then we pulled AI out as an example of something in which, the application of interdisciplinary research could really benefit understanding. And so the question that we had here was, when we think about opportunities and challenges facing the academy over the next few years, like how the rapid embrace of AI could both increase scholarly production, but also exacerbate ethical biases, what ways would you guys suggest as ways for interdisciplinary research to help in that? And then if you have any other specific examples or notes of other challenges to help scholars and all of that with interdisciplinary research, that would be helpful as well. Margaret, I don't know if you wanted to kick off on this one.
Sure. I think that what I'm deeply concerned about, because some of my research involves national security, information warfare, disinformation, misinformation campaigns, is data poisoning and the use of foundation models and generative AI in order to wage some of those geopolitical conflicts. And the more that you can shape the biases and the more that you can lead to polarization and destabilization, undermining faith in democratic institutions, for example, the more that you control that information ecosystem, which we all rely upon in the research that we do and in the academy. And so the biases, I think, are not just in what we've seen with the research and the establishment of biases in data and algorithm, but I think that embedding certain geopolitical conflicts in the way in which we actually use and the way in which we disseminate these generative AI systems, I think that we need to be aware that that can have other effects as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Robert, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I'd like to second Margaret's concerns, but then heighten them in a way that perhaps she does not agree with, or let me put it more generally. I find it amazing that academics who pride themselves on asking every possible question are not asking whether we have now moved to a stage in human history where the Enlightenment and modernity is coming to closure. And what I mean by that is that we have, following Kant and 18th century Enlightenment thinkers, we've assumed knowledge is power, and the more knowledge, the more power, the better. But if you look across a whole variety of different fields, we see the incredible, incredible dangers of knowledge production today. And so I think this is one of the reasons I wonder if I suspect that we are in a post-interdisciplinary era. We're entering into a post-interdisciplinary era because the question needs to become the control and the governance of knowledge. All of us saw the material earlier this year, Ezra Klein in the New York Times highlighted this, where some 10% of the researchers within AI itself thought that AI, artificial intelligence, represented an existential danger to the human race. Even if we back off that to something like the recent election and the sea of disinformation that we live within, the question I don't think we have quite broached yet is whether these technologies need to be controlled for the common good.
I agree. Cameron, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I don't have so much top-down policy proposals as sort of informal advice for everyone, which is I think we're all dealing with a deluge of new publications. There's a lot of hype, especially in AI. As Robert noted, there's a lot of stuff that's now just posted on archive that kind of have to keep up with at least some of it, but it's very difficult to sort through what's good and what's bad. I've found that the kind of social networks you can get and interactions you can get with researchers in other disciplines from, being interested in and occasionally practicing interdisciplinary research are just invaluable in trying to sort through this. So when, I have a background in computer science, but it's hard for me for every single paper that pops up on archive or that I see shared on social media that I think, oh, that could be relevant to what I'm working on, to completely go through the method section and the appendix and really try to sort through everything. But I still have a bunch of friends in computer science who work, are the, experts in these various applications of machine learning. And I can just tap them and say like, hey, should I take this seriously or is this just a hype result? Right. I would encourage everyone, if you find yourself overwhelmed by this kind of problem, as I imagine everyone does, try to start up an interdisciplinary reading group with some people who are interested in your discipline and maybe want your feedback on the applications of some of the things they're working on in their area, and just talk, start the conversations. I'm not sure that we need like really top-down solutions to this, but this has been my way to survive in with the pace at which things are moving.
I think the idea of an interdisciplinary reading group sounds fantastic, both for just, there's so much peer-reviewed knowledge coming out from all different areas. And then, to Robert's earlier point, in the broader infosphere, there's so much just overall information out there, whether or not it's been peer-reviewed. So putting together a group of trusted people to exchange articles and chapters and things like that is fantastic. Before we move on to the next question, Christine, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on the AI interdisciplinarity.
Just to riposte to Robert and his 18th century and Kant and Enlightenment, if you went back a little bit earlier in the 18th century, the scholar that I work on most, Jonathan Swift, actually could have foreseen actually the nightmarish properties of AI, I think, and the fear of information generation becoming completely out of control. I think he would have had a very dark view of these things and would have got it, I think, as he did so many other features of modernity. I'm not an expert on AI, but I have worked with a number of scholars in performance art and in the creative arts and in the humanities. And I've actually felt more optimistic about certain aspects of this, I'm afraid, particularly because I think that scholars who work with things like large language models and AI and creativity are really kind of interested in what it is that defines being human as opposed to what it is that defines being a machine. Now, you may say that in time, that distinction will be eroded, but it certainly raises the question of what is it that makes us human. And that has been, I think, a provocation which has been of intense value because it's kind of got to the heart of what the humanities do. I might be being naively optimistic, but it's certainly been a conversation that it's provoked, which we haven't really had in that kind of way before. And that straddles a lot of different disciplines. So I just raised that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that before we move on?
Well, I'd like to jump in and suggest that AI particularly raises what we could call a metaphysical question, which is, what are human beings for? You can get in a situation where the AI produces the knowledge and the AI then reads the knowledge and back and forth, and human beings become spectators to the infosphere. I think we're entering generally into a deeply philosophical era where we have to wrestle with fundamental questions like this.
Yeah, I think that that kind of ties in. I've started to keep an eye a little bit on some of the questions of folks who've been attending. So I want to kind of jump into one of those as well. So the question is, interdisciplinarity is the spirit of the time. All disciplines are currently coming together to produce more and better knowledge. The question, which honestly, I think, Robert, you had started to anticipate in one of your earlier comments. The question is, what are the limits? What are the challenges of co-authorship? What are the problems of, kind of break down a little bit further some of those problems of peer reviewing in the context of interdisciplinarity? So I think thinking about limits and the limits of that kind of research. So it's an open floor if anyone would like to jump in and tackle this one.
I guess I could start if nobody else is. I mean, one thing that I do worry about is we might go a little bit too far and say, just abolish the disciplines. They're antiquated. Only offer interdisciplinary degrees and so on. But I do think that the benefits of interdisciplinarity in part depend on having a deep grounding in expertise of the methods and epistemological practices and so on of particular disciplines. And there's a worry that if you didn't sort of periodically get a kind of deep grounding in the practices of a particular discipline, you might lose some of the benefits that make interdisciplinarity so valuable. If I didn't have people who were really world experts on machine learning methods that I could go tap and say, hey, is this just hype? Or, what are the right critical questions I should be asking about this from a technical perspective? Then, it wouldn't really help me to co-author with computer scientists or be in reading groups with computer scientists. And similarly, if I didn't have a deep grounding in philosophical questions and some of the standard worries you might have about standard philosophical positions, I wouldn't be able to help them answer some of the questions that arise that their methodological training doesn't prepare them to. So I think, within boundaries that we still need to preserve methods for particular disciplines. That's why we developed them in the first place, because they give you a kind of deep critical grounding and ways to skeptically regard knowledge production on a particular topic without treating them as these straitjackets that you can't get out of, but still needing to draw on them where appropriate.
And that baseline is still really important to be able to then jump forward to asking those other questions, engaging with those other theories. Would anyone else like to jump in on this one? Okay, so kind of as a potential counterpoint of sorts, are there any areas where, and Cameron, you started to anticipate maybe a little of this in your response, but as a counterpoint, are there any areas where the value of interdisciplinarity is potentially overstated? Christine, I saw you pop up, so I'm going to just ask you to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how to put this really, but I mean, interdisciplinarity has no kind of intrinsic value in itself, but it is a means to an end, and of course, it can become an end in itself. One of the fears that I have is that that as we move into a more interdisciplinary world in academia, that we just end up talking with each other across disciplines, but it still doesn't address the problem of how the academy engages with the outside and the wider world. So a more pressing issue really is, how do we engage with society? What is our remit for public engagement? We can talk to each other and build internal networks, instead of connecting in that way. And so if we can use it as a way of connecting with the outside world, I think that's very important. I mean, I just come at it from a humanities perspective, where we often say, oh, well, we're I do interdisciplinary research, but in a way, arguably, all I'm doing is working across cognate areas such as poetry, politics, landscape, design, architecture, and so forth and so forth. I suppose the larger challenge is to bring our subjects and our methodologies into conjunction with other radically different fields. And I think that's what Cameron said earlier on, actually, to open new perspectives on things. But I mean, it doesn't do everything, It
doesn't solve all problems all the time, apparently.
Yeah, could I build off of what Christina said? It's important to put into talk of interdisciplinarity within the context of a larger epistemic ecosystem, and to think about disciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. One of the dangers of interdisciplinarity is that it can be guilty of a kind of bait and switch. If you look back to the 1970 OECD report and its pushing of a kind of institutionalizing of interdisciplinary efforts, this was motivated by two issues. One was a kind of sense that problems are holistic, and we need a holistic approach. Interdisciplinarity does a good job of that, at least when it works right. But the other impetus was for policy relevance. And policy relevance really isn't an issue for interdisciplinarity itself. That's the task of transdisciplinarity. In my own transdisciplinary efforts, one of the shocks that I experienced right at the beginning was that when you go out to intelligent people who are looking for help and think that you may have some knowledge that can help them, I was shocked by the fact that they did not automatically assume that knowledge was good in and of itself, and that infinite knowledge production was somehow a good idea. Rather, this is something that came out of my work with the U.S. Geological Survey. Rather, they had a particular problem in the world to solve. If knowledge could help, great. But they wanted the knowledge now. They weren't interested in an endless speculation. And the knowledge was a tool to solve a non-epistemic problem. That awareness often gets gets skipped over when we work on problems in an interdisciplinary fashion.
I wanted to build upon
Margaret, please.
what Robert just said about interdisciplinarity versus transdisciplinarity. I think that that's a really important point. And for example, in AI law and policy, you might see a collapsing of boundaries. Is it a tort law issue? Is it a consumer protection law issue? Is it a civil rights issue? Is it all of those issues? Are you going to pull upon certain theories and practices of law and regulation in order to try to manage new threats and harms that are seen as unprecedented? And I think that that's very much transdisciplinarity. But I also wanted to really appreciate what Catherine and Cameron said as well, as far as trying to understand those boundaries and where do we need to break down those boundaries and when do we need to police the boundaries. So if we're looking at what are the goals of the interdisciplinary research for AI law and policy, for example, understanding philosophically where we can pull upon theoretical threads in order to excavate maybe the original meanings of enlightenment and the foundations philosophically of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but where do we need to draw upon the computer science community in order to better understand assessments and audits, for example, to try to preempt threats before they happen or have ongoing monitoring in the AI law and policy structures and regulations that we're creating. And so completely agree that understanding each one of those individually can really help us think about the type of outcomes and consequences that we're driving towards or we hope to aim for in the research that we do.
So with the last couple of minutes that we have, we've gotten some really great questions in that I know we're not going to be able to get to. But Margaret, building on what you were just kind of talking about a little bit, what would you think? And then the rest of the panel, please jump in. How do we go about better fostering communication between disciplines? The person adds, sometimes it feels like we're not even speaking the same language.
Yeah, I think that the idea of trying to pull a community together of individuals who do share some of those ambitions and research goals that you have, whether or not they're in computer science or philosophy or in the humanities or in history or law, it doesn't matter. I think that if you share, for example, a commitment to excavating first principles, or if you want to understand better the ontological and epistemological challenges that AI governance is posing, then you just find those scholars, you try to read their work together, and you try to engage, I think, in a joint enterprise. But keeping in mind what your goals and objectives and ambitions and dreams as a scholar and researcher are, I think are really critical.
Absolutely. I don't know, actually, Christine, do you have anything you'd want to add to that? I know with the work that you're currently building up at Torch.
No, I think that Margaret's absolutely right about that. And it is interesting that, we have these research hubs where people come from very different disciplines, both from within humanities, but from STEM and social sciences, all kinds of spaces. And those might be around something like climate change or, for example, medicine and something called medical humanities. But if people are sincerely committed to this, I mean, the outputs from this can be fantastic, actually, because, people are sharing that endeavor, basically, to find different ways of resolving and solving certain problems. And I think coming back to the interdisciplinary reading group model, that's kind of what this is. I was thinking that these are a group of 12 people, basically, who work together. And in this university at Oxford, that's been a fantastic space for us, basically. And the results have been really quite astonishing because, that I think there's been some fantastic initiatives coming out of that, which aren't simply to do with written documents, but, kind of social interventions. For example, our medical humanities group works with Oxfordshire County Council to improve health policy. So there's more likely to be an engagement with policymakers, which is something I'm really, really keen to try to promote. Yeah.
So I have one final question for you all, but before I do, Cameron or Robert, was there anything about that you'd like us to just highlight when it comes to fostering communication between folks from different disciplinary groups?
Yeah, you want to go first, Robert?
Okay. It's really, really important to change the incentive structures, the institutional incentive structures, and to rewrite the tenure and promotion guidelines, stuff like this. And that's, you run into a great deal. I have run into a great deal of resistance when I've tried to do that.
Absolutely. Cameron?
Yeah, so just a little bit of advice to everybody. If you haven't done interdisciplinary research before and you want to start to build those networks that we've all decided are valuable, I think it's really helpful to realize that every discipline has some kind of blinders and sacred cows and so on that don't get challenged or questioned when you're talking to other members of your own discipline. And you want to try to be aware of what those are before you start trying to start a conversation seriously with other people, because the first meetings can kind of go kind of badly if you don't, right? I mean, I'll pick on my own discipline. There's some areas of philosophy where you provide evidence for your view just by saying, here's a quote from the famous philosopher that supports my view. You give that to a machine learning researcher, a psychologist, they'll say, that's great. Why should I care what they said? Or, machine learning researcher can say, here, look, I just got this new benchmark on cross-validation for my computer vision model on ImageNet. Isn't that great? And the psychologist can say, yeah, but ImageNet is pretty different from the structure of the visual world, right? So, why do I care about that? And you need to be prepared to have answers to those questions rather than getting sort of offended or feel like they're missing the point or not appreciating what was really interesting about what you did. I think it's particularly helpful to look for people within your discipline or kind of halfway in your discipline that are already trying to build those bridges and, read some of their work, maybe even talk to them, what kind of things should I be prepared for? To explain or subject to critical scrutiny that maybe I never have before or wouldn't have to if I was just talking to members of my own department.
Perfect. Listen, I just want to thank you guys again so much for taking this time. This is such a robust and interesting conversation, and I think is going to, as the goal is obviously for interdisciplinary research, spring forth a number of questions for those who are able to join and listen, and hopefully those who are going to be able to catch the recording when it's emailed out to everyone. So with our last, 90 seconds or so, I just wanted to give everyone a chance for a closing statement of 20, 30 seconds or so. Is there anything that you wish we've been able to cover here while you're on the call, or just as Cameron has done really helpfully throughout, if there's a piece of advice that you would like to give a scholar who's just trying to embark in this new era? Robert, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I would just like to encourage us to find new and additional venues to continue these kind of conversations.
Absolutely. Margaret.
I just wanted to thank Oxford University Press for facilitating this type of conversation and for offering platforms and avenues for publishing interdisciplinary research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Christine?
Yes, really, to reiterate, I think what Robert said, I mean, I've already, in the course of setting this up, this webinar up, I've already, my thinking has already shifted in many different ways. So I would really love to be able to continue these conversations, because I think it's a brilliant space. Thank you for organising this. Thank you.
Fabulous. All right, Cameron, you get the last words. Anything to close out on?
Well, just easy answer to advice I give to younger early career researchers who want to get started in this is, especially if you're hired to do interdisciplinary research or as part of a kind of cluster hire or something like that, please, before you accept an offer, talk to somebody for whom it's not their first rodeo. And ... They will fill in the rest, I promise. But you want to be sure, what's in that offer and talk about how you're going to get your research evaluated before you accept.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. And so thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I'd just like to echo my interest in continuing this conversation as the publishing avenues continue to change, as we all are kind of grappling with so many changes at once. I found this incredibly useful, and I'm grateful for your time. So thank you everyone who joined, and I encourage those of you who sent really thoughtful and very long questions in through the chat to follow up with the panelists separately, because I think some of those questions we could have spent the whole time on. So thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your days and evenings. Bye.